Metal Up World, this is CJ with CJOrtiz.com and MetalMotivation.com. This is the first of a new 5-message series I'm doing entitled Romeo and Juliet versus 300, A Tale of Two Love Stories. Now, this is all being shown in my Life Domination online coaching program. You can learn more about that if you visit the link below. But all this week, Romeo and Juliet versus 300, A Tale of Two Love Stories. Well, you're going to have some indication that this series is going to be about relationships. It's about a very fundamental point about relationships, one that I particularly hold to, and one that maybe you've not heard before, that you may find challenging in your own life and may help you to adjust your perspective on the way you see things. You see, I often find that the changes that we need to make in life seem so difficult simply because our perspective isn't just right. Because we see things in a particular way, it's difficult for us to find the lasting motivation to actually overcome something. Yet, when we have a paradigm shift, action naturally kicks in. Changes begin to be made. That's why sometimes it's just really best to be taught. It's really best for you to learn and to glean as much as you can about those areas of life that need the greatest change. And for all of us, no matter where we are or how long we've been in a relationship, we could all use wisdom, we could all use counsel in relation to improving our relationships. But what I'm talking about this week is a fundamental paradigm shift. To shift from a paradigm that's basically governed the Western tradition for about 500 years. I would epitomize it in the story of Romeo and Juliet. Then you can set it over against, which we'll talk a little bit more about, the story portrayed in the film that came out a few years ago, 300, about the Spartans and their war with Persia. Now, you might be more familiar with the story of Romeo and Juliet, but not as familiar with the film 300. You don't have to be necessarily. I'll explain some of that as we go on. But it really typifies a basic change in the way relationships are looked at. Now, some people don't. The film 300 is a very violent movie about a war, but it's actually a love story. It begins with a great focus upon the king and the queen of Sparta. And by the time the king dies in the movie 300, sorry for the spoiler, but by the time the king dies in the film, he is calling out to his wife, his love, his queen. So it is very much a love story, but it's much, much different than the way love stories have been told throughout the Western tradition, like I said, for the past 500 years, which I would say, most fictional stories about romance and that sort of thing are basically a retelling of the story of Romeo and Juliet. Not that they die in the end, like in Romeo and Juliet, but that this fundamental change happens, and that is this. In the story of Romeo and Juliet, okay, the problem is that you have two family houses. Now, when we say houses in this story, it's not houses like the house that you live in. It's houses as in a clan, a family house. Like, for example, the royal family in England is called the House of Windsor. So obviously they're not talking about a physical edifice house. They're talking about a bloodline. They're talking about a royal family, so to speak. Well, this is basically what you had in Romeo and Juliet. Romeo was the offspring of one family's house, Juliet the offspring of another. Now, these two houses were in conflict. They hated each other, okay? So they did not want these two kids hooking up. Now, back in those times, that was very common with arranged marriages, that sort of thing. We live in a much, much different age now, okay? We live in a much different age. The idea that someone older than you would decide who you were going to marry would be crazy to you. You're going to make that choice, And with Romeo and Juliet, the reason why they ignored the requests of their respective families was what? Because they were in love. And that is where the basic story or idea of Romeo and Juliet has governed much of the romantic stories that we've heard since in the last 500 years. It's just a retelling of Romeo and Juliet. Because what are you basically saying? You're basically saying, forget what my tradition says, forget what my family says, forget everything I've been taught. I am in love. And because I'm in love, that relationship, that love that I have, takes the primary position over everything else. Everything else is secondary to that relationship. Well, the problem is that Romeo and Juliet, although put forward as a love story, which was actually a story of misery and woe. If you read the very end of Shakespeare's play, that's what he says. He says, this is a tale of misery and woe. He says there was no greater tale of misery and woe than that of Juliet and her Romeo. So it's a tale of misery and woe. It's not necessarily a suggestion for something you need to model after, but it is what we model after because we put the relationship in the primary position. Now you consider the fact that these two families in the Romeo and Juliet story represented again inheritance and wealth and land and property and bloodline, etc. So they were very, very it was critical who they intermarried with, and they did not want these two houses intermarrying. And in their mind, love was not the most important thing. Okay, and that's difficult for us to contemplate today. Isn't love the most important thing? Shouldn't we be falling in love? Shouldn't we find that best person for us? Well, I want you to think about something much, much broader. Now, I am middle-aged, okay, so I've done the family thing. I've raised kids. I've done all of that. And a lot of people in midlife are going into second relationships. You probably know more people that are divorced than you do know who are married these days. The divorce rate has been over 50% for a very, very long time. Well, obviously, then there's a fundamental problem with the way we see relationships. And I think a lot of it, although there is a multiplicity of reasons, I think part of it is the paradigm from which we look at relationships. I think we again are following the basic Romeo and Juliet model. I would argue that the families that those two kids were born from had more wisdom than those two kids. Granted, maybe some other arrangements could have been made, but that would have had something else to do with the story of Shakespeare or his intent of the story. But the point here is that there is wisdom to these things. Now, when I mention again that, people like me who have reached middle age and are in second relationships and that sort of thing, it becomes much, much more difficult to maintain those relationships. And there's a fundamental reason why. And that's because we're not 20, 21 anymore, falling hopelessly in love with our whole future ahead of us. We haven't really started our careers. We haven't had kids. We've got time to have these relationships, go places, do things. Well, when you're later on in life and you've already done those things, things become more economic. You start economic in the sense, not just in terms of money, but economic in the sense, what's the practical utility of this relationship? Is it just companionship? I just don't want to be alone. Or someone else says, no, I want someone to help me do something. Or no, I just want to take advantage of the last years that I have and get what I never had before. So people have their different reasons. But the point is that in your second half of life, you're thinking about it a whole lot differently than you did in the first half of your life. In other words, it's more than just falling in love. You've got other practical concerns, mixed families that already have kids, step parents and these sorts of things. There's a lot more to take into consideration than when you were young and didn't have any of those responsibilities, okay? When you didn't have any of that baggage. Okay, so it's two completely different things. So what I want to talk about this week in Romeo and Juliet versus 300, A Tale of Two Love Stories, is to sort of break down the nature of that Romeo and Juliet paradigm and how it has done maybe more damage than it has good. And then take a look at the film 300, and consider a fundamental, very primary thing that we have lost in the modern age that they used to take into consideration in the ancient times that may actually help us to save our relationships. And if the relationship is already lost, how to make the second one that you're in lasting and even richer and even better. So that's what we're covering all this week in this powerful, powerful series. Now, I always show the first episode of each series for free. If you'd like to see the rest of them, you can get them in my Life Domination online coaching program. It's a very simple online coaching program, very easy to use. You can do the whole thing from your phone if you want to, because it's all based on a private Facebook group, which I administrate. The only other people in there are dozens and dozens of people just like you and just like me, motivated people that are trying to improve their lives and achieve their goals and experience real and lasting change. What I do is I cover one subject each week in 5 videos, Monday through Friday, all shown in that private Facebook group. And you and I get to interact, you and I get to empower each other, ask questions, and it gives you a track to run on. Not only that, but you also get instant free access to my entire vault of video archives. Right now, there's over 350 videos in the archives. You would have immediate free access to those when you sign up. It's very inexpensive, less than $20 a month, so I think it's well worth the investment. So check that out. Just visit the link below, metalmotivation.com/Life Domination Coaching. This is CJ, the Metal Motivator. And remember, in whatever you do, don't suck. Metal up.